First, sovereignty, in the figure of the tyrant, you say, or tyrann?
Tyrant.
Deleuze notes in the passage on Bédide, I quote, "This is why tyrants are the heads not only of beasts, but also of pears, cauliflowers, or potatoes." You know that in the code, in the lexicon of the American administration, already before Bush, Saddam Hussein was called the beast of Baghdad. The beast of I come back to Deleuze's quote. "This is why tyrants have the heads not only of beasts, but also of pears, cauliflowers, or potatoes. One is neither superior nor external to that from which one benefits. The tyrant institutionalizes stupidity, but he is the first servant of his own system and the first to be installed within it. Slaves are always commanded by another slave." This is a very classical, modern, Platonician one, that tyrants are slaves. Second, evil or cruelty in their essential link to bêtise, that is bestiality. Here Deleuze is very eloquent and insistent. What he says is consistent with the gesture that makes bêtise the phenomenon of freedom as human freedom. What is remarkable is that the distinction between stupidity and error remains the essential condition for this interpretation of and this problematic. Deleuze writes, "How could the concept of error account for this unity of stupidity and cruelty, of the grotesque and the terrifying, which doubles the way of the world? Cowardice, cruelty, baseness, and stupidity are not simply corporeal capacity or traits of character or society. They are, I underline, this is my emphasis, they are structures of thought as such. They are structures of thought as such." So, before coming back to the structure of thought, philosophic and transcendental, I underline through some quotations the essential importance that Deleuze attributes to the link between stupidity and cruelty, and thus between stupidity and evil, between stupidity and freedom, between stupidity and responsibility, all traits that are supposed to be human and not animal in the classical tradition. The quote, Deleuze says, "All determinations become bad and cruel when they are grasped only by a thought which invents and contemplates them, flayed and separated from their living form, adrift upon this barren ground. Everything becomes violence on this passive ground. Everything becomes attack on this digestive ground. Here the Sabbath of stupidity and malevolence takes place. Perhaps this is the origin of that melancholy which weighs upon the most beautiful human faces, the presentiment of a hideousness, hideousness, peculiar to the human face, of a rising tide of stupidity, an evil deformity, or a thought governed by madness. For from the point of view of a philosophy of nature, madness arises at the point at which the individual contemplates itself in this free ground, and as a result, stupidity in stupidity and cruelty in cruelty, to the point that it can no longer stand itself." Quote by Deleuze, "A pitiful faculty then emerges in their minds, that of being able to see stupidity and no longer tolerate it." That's from Flaubert, It is at that point that Deleuze inserts the footnote that refers to Schelling, which reads as follows, I quote, the footnote, "Flaubert, Bouvard-Pécuchet," that's the reference, Schelling, Deleuze goes on, after having mentioned Flaubert, Bouvard-Pécuchet, Schelling wrote some splendid pages on evil, stupidity and malevolence. Its source, which is like the ground become autonomous, in parentheses, essentially related to the individuation. And on the entire history which follows from this in recherche philosophique sur la nature de la liberté, philosophical research on the nature of the essence of human freedom. And continuing after the inserted footnote, Deleuze says, it is true that this most pitiful faculty also becomes the royal faculty when it animates philosophy as a philosophy of mind. In other words, when it leads all the other faculties to that transcendent exercise which renders possible a violent reconciliation between the individual, the ground, and thought. Unquote. Page 152. Third point, thought. What is interesting in this structural link that Deleuze sees between bêtise and thought, what he calls the structure of thinking as such, la structure de la pensée comme telle. What is interesting is what he denounces as totally unable to think the thought of bêtise. What he charges or indicts here is the weakness or defect of thought. It is a double figure, a guilty figure of the same sin, the same fault, the same crime. Bad literature, pseudo-literature on the one hand, and on the other hand, philosophy. These are the two faults, the two flaws. Both of them would have missed the essence of bêtise, the essence of stupidity as a problem of thought. Deleuze will explain why. If philosophy and pseudo-literature miss stupidity as a thing of thought, so to speak, the best literature, la meilleure littérature, this is Deleuze's phrase, la meilleure littérature, the best literature, even if it doesn't address thematically or systematically the stupidity of thought, stupidity as a structure of thought, the best literature is haunted, that's Deleuze's word, is haunted by stupidity. The best literature is haunted by stupidity. It is haunted by, I quote again, the problem of stupidity. Deleuze thereby introduces the spectral lexicon of haunting that will carry the equivocal charge of the difference between pseudo-literature and philosophy on the one hand, and the best literature on the other hand. How can we visualize this haunting? What are the signs, positive, negative, denigrative, denials, presence of symptoms, absence of symptoms, explicit or implicit thematization, to what degree, and so on. Deleuze writes, the transcendental landscape comes to life. Places for the tyrant, the slave, and the imbecile must be found within it, without the place resembling the figure who occupies it, and without the transcendental ever being traced from the empirical figures which it makes possible. It is always our belief in the postulates of the cogitatio, which prevents us from making stupidity a transcendental problem. Stupidity can then be no more than an empirical determination, referring back to psychology or to the anecdotal, or worse, to polemics and insults. So he wants to restore, so to speak, the transcendental dignity of the problem of stupidity. It's not empirical or anecdotal, polemic and insult, and to the especially atrocious pseudo-literary genre of the sottisier. We call it sottisier in French, a collection of stupidities, bêtises.